Good morning and welcome to another week of Across the Pond. I'm completely out of my comfort zone here today, Barry. We're recording and I'm not looking at a camera. It feels weird.
It certainly is out of the comfort zone, Chad. We've done video podcasts for all of our episodes so far, and today we're going audio only because the quality of my internet here in quarantine is not that great. So unfortunately for the YouTube viewers, you're not going to be able to see our beautiful faces today, but hopefully our chocolate caramel voices will carry you through.
Well, let's hope we do just that. Welcome.
Across the pond with Barry and Chad.
And just like Barry said, he's really committed to the cause there for lockdown. I got really angry yesterday. I felt myself having to just pull away from it all because it was the most beautiful weather outside, and we literally had 21 degrees, and there were people walking on the street with their friends. The guy even had his shirt off, and I was just like, no, you can't do this. But yeah, it's just one of those, Barry. Hard to not feel emotionally involved in these kinds of things.
Yeah, definitely. I think all of us being kind of caged into our houses makes us all a little bit more on edge. And then we see people flouting the rules and taking things not as seriously as they should be. It certainly does get to you. So we're trying to stay calm as we can, but please stay indoors, people.
Absolutely. Well, let's go and have a look at what happened this past week. Today's episode is going to be a bit of a marathon session. There's so much to get through, a jam-packed episode. So hopefully you've got those earphones plugged in and ready to tune in. The week that was. So we're going to start this one off, as always, in the last couple of weeks, Barry, with our COVID-19 update. Obviously, if we look at the worldwide number of cases, we've now exceeded 1.2 million, which is just insane exponential growth in this last week.
Yep, it really has shown that this thing keeps spreading and keeps growing every single day. These cases are growing at an exponential rate, like you say, and we haven't quite flattened the curve across the world just yet. We've had portions of the world that are starting to stabilize, but there's other portions that are still ramping up. So still a long way to go. I don't think 1.2 million is the max. I think we're going to still go a lot more, and lots of fights against against this disease.
Absolutely. Well, the next thing that you've got down here, Barry, is something that I found absolutely fascinating. We've spoken about Bill Gates on and on and on in this podcast. And this type of measure, for me, is really insane for sort of an individual to kind of pick up what's not being done around the world. Tell us more about it.
Yes, so obviously the only way to kind of flatten this curve properly and to kind of stabilize this disease is to find some sort of vaccine. So some sort of vaccine that we can put into production and get all around the world to try and make sure that we can contain this disease's spread. Now, this vaccine, obviously, there's a huge amount of effort being put in right now into trying to find the vaccine, trying to figure out what is going to work, what is going to be useful, what is going to fight this disease, because it's a brand new strain. We don't have any ideas. We're kind of working off a bunch of different theories and whatnot, but no one's actually got a working vaccine just yet. But what Bill Gates is doing is he's realizing that even if you find the right vaccine, there's still going to be a significant bottleneck when it comes to trying to produce enough of it and get it all around the world to all the various cities around the world, right? And so that bottleneck comes down to how much capacity do you have to produce this vaccine when we finally find it. So what he's gone and done is decided, cool, we need mass manufacturing capacity for this vaccine. How do we make sure we get that, and how do we make sure we get it as quickly as possible? And out of his personal money and out of the money of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he's donated billions of dollars to fund 7 different candidates who are all working on different versions of what a vaccine could look like, and helping them scale up their manufacturing company and kind of scale up their capacity to be able to make thousands and hundreds of thousands of vaccines in a very short space of time. So I think it's really cool, Chad, because he's funding 7 of these candidates, knowing that there's probably likely only going to be one of them, maybe 2, that actually works out. And so for 5 or 6 of these ginormous manufacturing concerns, it's going to be wasted money. But in his mind, it's not a waste, because by making sure the manufacturing capacity is ready as soon as a vaccine is found, it gives us the best possible chance of cutting this as quickly as we can. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think it is really cool, but it's insane, like you said, just in terms of throwing money at something that a large portion of is going to be wasted. Wasted in an economic sense, but in terms of looking at the number of lives that could have potentially been saved in the extra number of months, that this sort of approach would give is an insane decision to make, and especially when somebody is prepared to put their personal money forward, especially with these kinds of numbers, knowing that this kind of thing is happening. I almost feel like some sort of coalition needs to come together at the end of this, and almost, help out and pay a little bit of this back.
Yeah, a lot of the social commentary online was that these are the sorts of things that governments should be doing and like world
Definitely.
organizations should be doing. Like, why are we relying on a billionaire philanthropist to do this kind of stuff? And it kind of talks to the misalignment between what governments are working on and what kind of entrepreneurs and people who think about these pandemics quite seriously are doing. So obviously this is a bottleneck that we're going to face, and like you say, there should be a coalition of governments or world leaders or that kind of stuff who are putting this money to use to ensure that when we have the vaccine, which we hope will happen in the next couple of months, we then have the capacity to be able to generate enough of it and get it all around the world. It seems like a no-brainer to me.
Absolutely. No, definitely agree there. Moving on to the first region, if we kind of dip into it in a little bit more detail, the US we spoke quite a lot about last week, and there's been a complete change in strategy here. Obviously, the exponential growth that we've been seeing there has just been insane. We spoke last week about the inaction over there, and now, I mean, if you look at the number of deaths, nearly 8,500, really is a staggering number. So what's happened this past week? What's been the drive for this change, especially when it comes to Trump and his opinion on this?
Yeah, so Trump has kind of been found with a bit of egg on his face. After telling the media for weeks at a time that US has got it under control, we've got everything under control, we're doing a great job, etc., etc., my ratings are amazing, all that good stuff. He finally had to face the fact that these numbers are growing crazily fast, especially in places like New York. And so, unfortunately, like the US has now had to go into complete crisis management, trying to make sure they get as many doctors on board. They're trying to get PPE into the country. There's lots of drama around that. And they're seeing a huge exponential growth in the number of cases and the number of deaths in the US. Some people are forecasting 100,000 deaths in the US, which is crazy. Some people are forecasting more than that. And so there's serious concern there right now. And a lot of anger is being thrown around because of the government inaction early on in the process. So now Trump has kind of changed his whole strategy. He's very, very apologetic now. He's very kind of on board with what the CDC recommendations are and trying to do his best to now force the various states to do various lockdowns and close down the economy and whatnot. One of the big things he changed his mind on is he was telling people that the economy was going to go back to work on, I think, the 16th of April, which is very, very soon. And he had to come out and say, listen, that's actually not going to happen. Like it's now extended at least to the 30th of April and probably beyond that. And so I think Trump is coming to terms with the realistic nature of this virus and what it's going to do to his economy.
It's really sad that we need to wait for things like this to happen, to wait for this to explode really like this before somebody actually changes their tune. And that for me is the limitation of arrogance. In my mind, holding a position like this without looking at what the rest of the world is doing, without taking consultation from professionals, is really just asking for trouble. And arrogance for me has no place in this world.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's one of those examples of when people hold on to a belief because it works in their favor or it's their brand or whatever. He's known as the guy who's going to keep the US economy like high and going strong and whatnot. And so in the face of other evidence that proves otherwise, if you hold too tightly on your beliefs, you end up looking like an idiot.
Yep.
And so Trump really has got egg in his face right now, and I don't know how the election is going to go. Unfortunately, there aren't any real contenders to him. Like Joe Biden doesn't really fill me with confidence. Bernie Sanders is not really going to do it. So I don't know what the election is going to happen, but Trump has certainly faced a lot of backlash from this, and a lot of people calling for his head because of the way he's dealt with this.
Yep.
And the US is going to have a lot more deaths than it should have because of his inaction.
Absolutely. Sad fact that. But we'll certainly have to see, as you say, the effect on the election as well. Now, moving on to the UK, obviously this past week we've seen an increase as well that's been fairly dramatic. If I look at the beginning of the week, we were looking at numbers of around 200 deaths a day. And, it's now surpassed 700. So again, really scary escalation in 1 week. As of Sunday, there's nearly 5,000 deaths in total. And last night, Sunday night as well, Boris was admitted to hospital for tests. Everyone's saying that it's just precautionary. It's kind of on the back of advice from his GP, but certainly worrying again, Barry, that the person at the helm of this fight is infected and clearly suffering a bit from that.
Yeah, I think it reminds us that no one is immune from this, right? It doesn't matter your status, doesn't matter your class, doesn't matter what position you hold. Everyone is at risk. And so when your national leader goes into hospital, it certainly doesn't look good from a PR perspective, and it certainly will cause more fear in the UK population. You need strong leadership at a time like this. You need a leader who's able to calm the masses, who's able to manage the panic, manage kind of the paranoia. And when he's in hospital, it's a bit tough. So let's wait and see as to what those test results show and what's going to happen with Boris. But certainly I'll falter with him.
Absolutely. Now, one of the other things we spoke about last week, Barry, was the XL London venue. Now, that is the venue that they've turned from an expo centre into a hospital. It's been dubbed the Nightingale Hospital. And what we've seen this past week is that the owner of that property, the Abu Dhabi National Exhibitions Company, is charging the health service between £2 and £3 million a month for that venue. Now, it's one of those where obviously this venue is being used, but, you'd like to think that this venue would not have been used, for any purposes during this time because of the fact that, expos do not follow the social distancing rules. And obviously the way that this venue is now being used is going to save many, many lives. Do you think that this kind of arm's length rent transaction should be happening at this point in time when, in terms of a philanthropic endeavor, something else could have taken place here?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how arm's length that is. I'm not sure what the numbers are relative to. But from my perspective, this is how capitalism works. Like those guys are paying a lease on that land in London, which is going to cost a fortune, and so I can understand them charging some sort of amount. I've got no idea whether 2 to 3 million is crazy or not. I don't know exactly. I don't know much about the actual expo center. But I think that what we have to be careful in these situations is people profiteering or people price gouging off these sorts of things, right? So I think that it's important that I think people should be able to make some money at least to try and pay costs and whatnot. But how much above market rate related rental, how much above kind of pandemic related rental, I don't know. It's a difficult one because they are paying a lease there, Chad. So I don't know if it's fair to ask them to donate that money like that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, Barry. Completely get your points there. I have no idea, like you said as well, in terms of whether that is arm's length or not. But we'd hope that that's not sort of over the top kind of profiteering off of this type of scenario. One of the worries when we had such good weather this weekend, like I said in the intro, is that people, like you say, kind of flout the rules. People go to parks to sunbathe, which, for a South African probably sounds really strange. But people literally in summer and heat of summer normally just go to parks and go in swimming costumes and catch up all the sun that they can. We saw this happening this weekend, and on the back of that, there's been threats that potentially those lockdown measures may escalate. We've obviously spoken about this in the past, but that would certainly be quite a terrible one for the majority of the population who's actually been complying with this, and potentially our privilege at the moment to actually go and exercise, leave the house once a day for exercise, might be revoked. That's a terrible thing.
Yeah, that's the problem with these things. Like for that person who's doing that sunbathing, they probably don't think it's that bad. They're like, I'm here by myself. I didn't really I didn't encounter anybody. It was kind of doing my own thing. It wasn't that much harm. But the problem is it sets a precedent. And once one person sees that person doing it, then they're more likely to, maybe I can bend the rule. Maybe I can bend the rule. And before you know it, you've got a worse problem in your hands. I think what people have to realize is that if you aren't going to comply with the rules over this short lockdown period, the lockdown is going to be extended and it's going to be made worse. So the more you kind of hunker down and just kind of do your bits and do your part in this short period, it saves you time in the long run. It's one of those like delayed gratification things. We have to do this now and seriously now for a short period of time to help us not have to lock down for months at a time going forward. Yeah. And so I think it's important for people to realize that like I understand that it's tough being like locked inside at home and especially when you got the sun outside, you never see it in the UK. But please take this thing seriously and you'll have lots of sun in the future to do your sunbathing in rather than like taking a risk now.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, just a bit of a plea. I highly doubt any of our listeners are in that group. But if you are, guys, please do the right thing. We're all in this together and we want this to be over as soon as possible. One of the other things we saw last night was an unprecedented address. Barry was telling me about the number of occasions that this has actually happened. And, I think it can be counted on less than two hands, where the Queen actually came through and did an address on Sunday evening and started off by thanking essential workers. She also then thanked those who are staying at home, which I take as a bit of a veiled message to those who aren't. You don't deserve that, thanks. And some of the other things that she said was hopefully in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge. Again, setting this message that if you look at yourself in 20 years' time, are you going to be proud by the way that you responded today? Were you complying? If we remain united and resolute, then we will overcome it. And also kind of was very sympathetic in the way that she admitted self-isolating is a challenge, but it presents an opportunity to slow down, pause and reflect, which is what we've been chatting about in the last couple of weeks. And just closing it off with saying, while we have more to endure, better days will come. And that's kind of that light at the end of the tunnel that we've been looking for, Barry. A lot of commentators saying here that this speech has her hands on it. Although she may have got a little bit of input from Prince Philip, it doesn't sound like there was a lot of, pushing by Downing Street or pushing by other various entities. This is her speech and, quite a sympathetic one. What do you think, Barry?
I really like the message. I think it's important to realize that we are living through a point in history, right? This point in history we're going to look back on in time, and like you say, and like she says, how are you going to think about your actions during this period? So in 20 years' time, when you're telling your kids about this moment, or you're reading about this moment, are you going to be proud of how you acted? And I think that's an important thing to remember, is that it might feel like it's the end of the world, and it might feel like this quarantine is very, very challenging, but it's actually going to be a blip in time when you look at your life, right? So you're going to look back on this in time, and it's going to be a small blip in time. So just make sure you do your best to act in the right way during this small period. It's a very, very important period for us. And I think that by realizing that and taking that time to reflect and doing what you need to do, you'll be able to look back on this time with pride and realize that we actually made it through the seemingly insurmountable odds.
Absolutely. I kind of got the exact same thing from it. I just thought it was really sincere. This one figurehead that kind of just surpasses everything else. She's sort of above government, has the respect of people across the world, and really can kind of just command that kind of message. And hopefully we can see some effect. Also in terms of the timing, it's kind of an interesting timing where we see a weekend where people start kind of swaying a little bit from the rules, and here you have the Queen, this figurehead who kind of steps in just at that time. Don't you think that's interesting, Barry?
Yeah, I think so. I think they obviously planned this as best they can to try and manage that from PR perspective. Like you said, the Queen commands a lot of respect from the UK population. And so it's really good to see her making this kind of statement. And on a Sunday, like you say, hopefully sets you up for a brand new week to come from Monday, and you can kind of knuckle down and do what you need to do, and that means staying at home. So yeah, I think it's really cool.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to the business effects here in the UK. This past week, we've seen Debenhams are set to head into administration. Now, they've been under some trouble for some time, but obviously all of those stores being closed, the kind of natural train of progression. Arcadia, the top shop owners, are set to potentially hand in notice on up to 550 stores and their leases that they have on those. Cath Kidston as well, another retail chain, has also filed a notice to appoint a law firm as administrators. And the last one here is Grant Thornton has asked employees to take a 40% pay cut to avoid redundancies. Obviously, we expected these kinds of things, Barry, but sort of 2 weeks in, certainly a lot more of these things to come from this lockdown, which is potentially going to be over the next couple of months.
Yeah, definitely, Chad. I think that we're going to see a lot more of these things. A lot of businesses are not going to survive this period. I think it's interesting to think about the fact that some people believe that just by pausing a business for 2-3 weeks, and then you can just restart it at the resumption of the normal business, right? And unfortunately, if anyone's ever been in a business, you know that's not how it works, right?
Yeah.
You can't just pause a business and then come back 3 weeks later. So even if a company is strong right now, if the lockdown goes on for a significant period of time, there's no chance that a lot of these guys are going to be able to restart. And so I think a lot of people are trying to take proactive action, trying to do their best to take care of their employees if they know they're not going to survive this period. But we're going to hear lots and lots of these stories, Chad, over the next couple of weeks. And unfortunately, that's going to be the ginormous economic impact we're going to see across the world because of this virus.
Absolutely. It's certainly going to have a lasting and profound impact and change to the way that we live, indeed. Now, the last one I wanted to just bring up here because it kind of came across my screen this morning, and I thought straight away it is absolutely ridiculous. How can educated people sort of believe this? But there's rumors going around that 5G causes coronavirus by sucking air from your lungs. And what's happened on the back of that, Barry, you'll never believe, is that people have actually been vandalizing 5G masts as a result. We've seen BT make a statement that these claims are baseless and kind of imploring people not to damage their infrastructure. And if you kind of think about it, obviously our networks and our sort of cellular infrastructure is now the most important thing that we have to still keep in touch. And people are kind of destroying these masts. It's almost like sticking a hole in a life raft, as we need this infrastructure now more than ever. Don't you think it's ridiculous, Barry?
Oh, Chad, you know how I feel about this kind of lack of fact checking and fake news. It really makes me angry when I hear stories like this. And we had a similar one in South Africa we'll come to in a little bit. It really is terrible. I mean, I don't know if some people are trolling it. I don't know if it's actually as serious as it makes it out to be. But the moment people start taking these things for real and then go and vandalize actual technology, I mean, like you say, it's shooting yourself in the foot. So it really is stupid. It's one of those stories and one of those things that becomes a meme, becomes something that spreads very quickly, and people don't think about it. They just kind of share without even giving it a moment's consideration. It's simply ridiculous.
Well, hopefully that kind of dies down a little bit. Moving on to Spain, I just wanted to mention this. Obviously, we've been kind of checking in and out with where they're at. And I saw this past weekend that they seem to be close to passing the peak as the number of deaths have fell for 2 consecutive days. Certainly a positive message. And, like we've been saying for a lot of nations, something like this is kind of a signal to the start of the end, something that we should all kind of hold on to.
Yeah, these are the little pieces of good news we need to hang on to as we kind of think about this on a global basis. We've seen with Italy, if they've started to reach their peak, and now you say Spain as well, starting to get to their peak. Hopefully this is the case. Obviously with testing numbers, there's always a little bit of a lag and a little bit of unverification there, so we'll have to wait for a few more days to see if the trend is actually that. But it really is good news, and hopefully Spain has finally got themselves stabilized and got themselves to a point where they can manage the disease going forward. And we have to wait for this kind of peak period for all the other countries that are still on the up of the curve, and hopefully we get there as soon as we can so we can start moving on from this virus.
Absolutely. Barry, why don't you tell us what happened this past week in your side of the pond, South Africa?
Sure thing. So in South Africa, we've been in lockdown for a week now. So well done for everyone who survived the week. It's been an interesting time in South Africa. I think a lot of people are watching the news and kind of using that as their gauge into what's happening around the country. As at the 6th of April, which is just before we recorded this, South Africa has 1,585 reported cases and 9 deaths, which I think has gone up to 11 this morning, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. So at the moment, we are still in the calm before the storm. I think that we've done very well so far to kind of flatten the curve as best we can, but we certainly aren't anywhere near the peak yet, and so we still need to keep being like very strict about ourselves, not be complacent, because as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to maintain this lockdown. And as South Africans, like I think we are standing together. I think that the morale in the country is actually quite good compared to what we expected, and based on the fact that our economic situation is quite dire. But I think everyone is trying to pull together as best they can, and everyone is quite buoyed by the fact that our numbers haven't exponentially grown yet. So people are very happy with that. Yeah. And as they start to roll out mass testing over the next week or so, we'll hopefully get the sense that this data is actually accurate. There obviously is a risk that because we haven't done enough tests, that maybe this data is wildly underestimated, but we'll have to wait and see on that. Talking about the lockdown, Chad, obviously the big concern in South Africa is not necessarily the health stuff, it's more the economic impacts of this kind of lockdown. And so there's been various calls for all sorts of changes to the lockdown, and the presidency and his ministers announced a few changes to our strict lockdown as of yesterday. And some of these changes are as follows. The first change was that people are now allowed to travel to a different province for the funeral of an immediate family member. So this was a very controversial one because obviously you don't want people traveling across provinces because there's some provinces that haven't been impacted as much yet, and so there's a risk of taking the virus with them. But in the African community, in the African religion, kind of how they think about their funerals, it's very important that their family members are buried in their hometowns, which are often not in the cities of Johannesburg, Cape Town, etc. So there's interesting cultural dynamics here, trying to give a little bit of leeway for families to be able to go and bury their family members so that they can get the right ancestral burial grounds and all that good stuff, while trying to manage that trade-off with the actual health implications of people potentially going across borders. So it's been a very controversial one, but they've tried to make that a new change to the lockdown. The second change was also controversial, was that they've relaxed some strict lockdowns on taxi drivers. So taxis are now allowed to transport people in essential services at a max of 70% capacity of their vehicle. So
Okay.
obviously, for a lot of workers who are working in grocery stores or in hospitals or any of the essential services that are still running at this time, some of them don't have their own transport. Some of them live in rural townships and they need to get into the city to work. And so taxis are their only way to get to work. So it's kind of a unavoidable one. Obviously, trying to manage how many people are in those taxis. In South Africa, taxis are notoriously overcrowded all the time, and so they're trying to manage that capacity as best they can. And I believe you have to show the permit to the taxi driver to be able to get into the vehicle in the first place. And so that has been relaxed a little bit to some consternation. But of course, in South Africa, we have unique challenges, and taxis are such an important piece of this economy. So it kind of makes sense there. The last one I want to cover is that spaza shops are now allowed to operate as an essential service, again, after much controversy. So we're learning a lot about our country here. I think a lot of people don't think about spaza shops, especially like in my social circles, because we buy from Woolworths and Pick and Pay, and we're very lucky to be able to shop from major retail stores. But in the more rural areas where there aren't those big retail stores, aren't the big shopping malls, spaza shops operate as tiny little grocery stores, right? Kind of like mom and pop owned, small little retail outlets that sell basic foods and items. And initially they weren't allowed to operate because they weren't considered an essential service. And after much like boycott and much drama, they are now allowed to operate, which I think is the right move. Because to get food to people, we can't expect them to stand in 4-kilometer lines outside of Checkers because they have to drive 20 kilometers to get there, right? Where their local spaza shop can also operate. So those are some of the changes to restrictions, Chad. We're going to wait and see if there's any more changes in the next week or so. But in South Africa, we are doing okay for now, I would say.
Yeah, that's a really good little update there. And in terms of those changes, they definitely do seem reasonable. Like you said, taxis are kind of the replacement of what other countries would have as public transport. And, although here in the UK, there's, a much sort of condensed amount of public transport going through, it still is very much up and running for those people who need to get around for essential services. So that kind of does make sense. My only concern, though, is that 70% percentage point. Do you think that's enough to curb the spread of this, knowing how small those minibuses are and those taxis are, to still be able to carry 70% of their passengers? As far as I know, that 100% sort of capacity is kind of like 15 odd passengers or so. That's still a lot of people in one vehicle.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is where the economic trade-off comes in, and the fact that if a taxi is only half full, the driver's not making any money, right? Because unfortunately, the price of petrol and kind of the taxi fares in the country, it's a very, very low margin business. So if a taxi driver is going to be driving at 50% capacity, he's not going to be able to sustain himself. So I think that's the difficult trade-off there. I agree with you, 70% is not ideal, and it's probably too many people for the health reasons. But to enable these taxi drivers to actually sustain their business, they're going to need to have that kind of capacity sometimes. And so I think that is the difficulty in South Africa, where we don't have the support, the economic support, to try and match the health recommendations from around the world.
Yeah, certainly is a tricky situation. But yeah, glad to see that some of those measures have now been opened up. Like you say, spaza shops are essentially the same thing as big retailers. Not sure why those were not allowed initially, unless it is on the specific effects of alcohol, which South Africa's obviously taken quite seriously as well. That you cannot actually purchase any alcohol. I would kind of understand from that point of view, but in terms of allowing to buy essentials, that just seems completely unnecessary, and I'm glad that that's been opened up. That takes us past this week that happened. Now let's look at some of the things that we found interesting. Stuff I found interesting. So in Stuff I Found Interesting, the first one is one that Barry put down, and I had a read of this article, which I thought was absolutely fantastic, and it kind of made me feel a lot less guilty as well. The key message here, Barry, why don't you take us through it?
Yeah, so this is something, Chad, that I'm very, very bad at. I've had this terrible habit throughout my life. It's of finishing books that I'm not enjoying, right? I really love reading, and I read a lot of books, but I've got this weird thing when I start a book, I feel like I have the duty and the obligation to finish the whole thing. Yeah. And that results in me slogging through books that I'm actually not enjoying. And when you're slogging through a book that you're not enjoying, it can take you months to finish it.
Definitely.
And it's a serious opportunity cost when you think about it, because you could be putting that book down and reading something you actually enjoy. Yep. And this article that we're referencing here it really did stand out to me as well. It's called How to Read, with the subtitle Lots of Inputs and a Strong Filter. And basically, it's a very short article, very easy article. Basically, the thesis is start lots of books. So buy lots of books, get a whole bunch on your bedstand, on your bookshelf. Don't have like a censorship in that input phase. Like, get lots of inputs into your reading diet. But once you started a book and you get to page 50 and you're still hating it, or you're not enjoying it, or you're finding it slow, or it's not for you, don't waste time slogging through it. Rather put that book aside. Be like, that book wasn't for me. It just wasn't the right thing. Let me actually find a book that I actually get value from. And the reason this resonates with me is because, like I said earlier, I'm really bad at this. I feel like there's this guilt. And you mentioned the guilt. I think that's right.
Yeah.
I feel this guilt that I haven't finished this book. But if you think about it, if you look at how many books you're reading in a year, and it could be anything from 1 to 20 to 50, you only have so many years in your life, and there are like a gazillion good books out there. There's no reason at all to waste time reading bad books, because there are so many good ones out there. And so even if it's a book that you've been recommended by a friend, even if it's a book that's theoretically a classic, one of the best books ever made, it doesn't matter. If you're not enjoying it, then don't read it. Like, rather find a book you actually find value from. So lots of inputs, lots of books on the shelf, and a strong filter. So being able to quit as quickly as you can to get to a book you actually enjoy.
Yeah, I love the message, and I think a lot more people will get into reading if they take this approach. I think a lot of people like you and me feel like they need to trudge through to the end of the book, and by the end, it's not enjoyable. If it hasn't gripped you, it's just not enjoyable. And I think for a lot of that reason, people will rather watch Netflix because you can very, very quickly either get grabbed in something and not feel guilty to watch the end of a movie if you're not enjoying it. So it's weird that we kind of don't draw that same parallel. And this little quote that I took from it, which I thought was great as well, is similar to dating. A book you're not into after 10 minutes of attention has little chance of a happy ending. Slam it shut and move on. You're not a failure if you quit a book after 3 pages any more than if you reject the proposition of a 10-hour date with someone you just met who annoys you. Lots of fish in the sea. And that kind of captures it really nicely, Barry.
I love that quote. I really do. I think it's really cool. And I think it's something that will, like you say, it'll encourage you to actually enjoy reading. And it's not about the amount of pages you get through. It's about the amount of good books that you read. And good is different for every single person. So I think it's something I need to take on board. It's advice I'm trying to give myself, trying to fight that urge to just finish books for no reason, and trying to make sure that what I'm reading, I'm actually finding value from. I think it's really important. And hopefully, like you say, Chad, it'll get you to actually read more, because if you're enjoying it, you're more willing to do it.
Well, I'm going to touch on one of the points you mentioned there, which is good is different for everyone. And basically something that I did this past weekend was watch the first Star Wars. Cue claps from all of the big Star Wars fans out there. I'd never watched any of the franchise. And, one of the reasons why I hadn't is because I had these preconceived ideas about what these movies would be like. I kind of put them right in the distance to all the heavy nerds watch this. And, although I'm a very big computer nerd, I'm kind of not that kind of nerd. And, I had these ideas in my mind about what they would be like. And I kind of just hold on to that. And I think that's a really dangerous thing to do, because, if you're not open to that experience, just like we spoke about the books, you may miss out on decades long of referring back to something that is actually really cool and something that you actually enjoy. And after watching the first Star Wars and being quite proud of this to Barry, I then what followed was a lot of peer pressure to watch The Lord of the Rings, to stop what I'm doing and watch The Lord of the Rings. And so I did that too. And so I feel like it was a very good weekend in terms of catching up on the stuff that, a lot of people have been saying I've been missing out on life from not watching these 2 franchises. But don't you think that's a dangerous thing to do, Barry, to sort of hold on to what you think your preconceived idea would be?
Yeah, I definitely do think it's dangerous. I think it's you do yourself a disservice if you're not going to look at a piece of art for its own merits and for what you think about it, right? Everyone's got different opinions, and so if you're going to let the opinions of other people kind of color your experience, you're never going to have a full original thought about something. So, for example, like a Star Wars thing, I'm a very proud friend, Chad. I'm very proud you finally got to watch it. And it's a classic set of movies and a classic story that really means a lot of different things to different people. Definitely. So like you say, you had connotations in your mind about what it meant to you, but there are 1,000 other interpretations, some of them good, some of them bad, about the same piece of art. And so I think it's similar to the books. Like rather give it a chance. Like give these things a chance. If you do hate it, that's also okay. Like you don't have to like everything. You don't have to like every piece of art that's ever been made. But being able to give it a chance and look at it on its own merits, and realize that maybe I can get something out of this movie that's different to what my friend got out of it, or what the IMDb reviewers got out of it, or whatever the story is. I think it's important to look at it on its merits and kind of just take it for what it is. Don't let preconceived notions get in the way of enjoying something that someone made.
Completely agreed. And if you're wondering what I thought of them, after that 5 hours of catching up on these classics, I thoroughly enjoyed them both, funnily enough. Obviously, the Star Wars, that dates back quite a bit. So some of the graphics was definitely enjoyable in retrospect. But that racing scene holds up to its own, even now, where, little young Skywalker is racing on the back of this bet that gets him out of this pickle that they're in. Certainly was, very, very enjoyable to watch. And even just the fight scenes, to kind of think of how they actually animated this all 20 years ago is quite insane. Similar to Lord of the Rings, I said to Barry, a complete roller coaster. So many different plots unfolding at different times, different species, and they all have their own backstories. And really just how this group of people get together, the fellowship, on this quest, on this mission. And yeah, just a really cool little journey, and really cool graphics as well in terms of some of the scenes there. So definitely enjoyed those. And like I said, I didn't think I would have.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I asked Chad when he told me, is that, do these things hold up? Because I know that Star Wars and Lord of the Rings were both made a while ago, and they were revolutionary in their time. Like the kind of the special effects they brought to bear, and kind of the storytelling and the way they built these giant worlds with, like you say, with all these various subplots and characters. They were like one of the kind when they came out, and that's why they were so impactful. And so I was wondering whether they held up in a 2020 world where we've seen lots of like full world building stories, Game of Thrones and Harry Potter and all these guys to come after these ones. And so I'm glad to hear that pieces of them do hold up, and I think that there are pieces of history when it comes to filmmaking and storytelling. So I'm super chuffed that you're getting into them, Chad, and hopefully you can enjoy what's left.
Thanks, Barry. Yeah, and actually one other thing I forgot is I also this past week watched the first Frozen, which I haven't seen before. I don't know why Barry's still friends with me, because I'm really just...
Dude!
I'm really just putting black dots next to my name at this point. But yeah, thoroughly enjoyed that story as well. And that sets up a great privilege of being able to watch the second, which I know Barry thoroughly enjoyed as well.
I can't believe you hadn't watched Frozen, Chad. That is shocking. Listeners, listen. If you're sitting right now with headphones in your ears, you're sitting in your self-isolation, and you haven't seen Frozen or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or Harry Potter, do yourself a favor, please.
Do yourself a favor, indeed. And you got the time now, so why not? Let's move on and look ahead. Looking ahead.
This week on Looking Ahead, we are thinking about the impact that the virus has had on the world and what kind of tech and what things are going to come out of it as we look forward into the future. And so, Chad, I came across this interesting little table on Tyler Cowen's blog, which is one of my favorite blogs in the world. I swear by it. And he had this table of talking about what has changed in the last couple of weeks because of this global pandemic. Yep. And he leads with a quote from, I think it was from Lennon, but that's the attribution's a bit dodgy there. But the quote goes as follows. There are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen.
Yep.
And that kind of sums up for me how I've felt over the last couple of weeks. I feel like the whole world has shifted in the space of no time. Definitely. After kind of a lag and a kind of a more stagnant period of the last couple of years. Yep. And so what he does is he draws a table and he points to world 1.0, which is like the world before coronavirus, and world 2.0, which what the world after coronavirus might look like. And so I thought I'd go through some of them and we could chat about one or two if they're interesting. Cool. The first piece is World 1.0 was physical. World 2.0 has to be digital.
Yeah.
And I think it's key to see this because I think that coronavirus has been the biggest digital transformation coach in the world for businesses around the world by forcing them to think digital and realize that if their business is not digital, they don't have a shot in the new world.
Yeah, couldn't agree more there, Barry. It is, like you say, it's just this catalyst that's kind of shifted these changes that I think would have potentially happened in a number of years. But, it's really just been that flame up our backsides to kind of just push us into the gear of this digital working world and kind of leverage all of the benefits that we can potentially get from it.
Exactly. The next one is World 1.0 is linear growth. World 2.0, we're learning all about exponential growth. And the best way to learn about exponential growth is to go through something like this, because we start to understand what those curves actually mean. And they're not just graphs anymore, but they're actually crazy numbers that grow incredibly fast. And so that's an interesting change we've seen. I think a lot of people are learning what exponential growth is through this whole thing. And hopefully they'll carry forward into how we think about things like Moore's Law, how we think about technology going forward, is understanding how quickly things can change.
Sure.
The third piece is looking at how we work. And so World 1.0 is we're in the office by default. World 2.0 might be that we're remote by default. So maybe we are remote working for most of the time, and we come into the office to gather together for short periods of time, right? Because I think a lot of people are realizing that when they thought they were working 8 or 9 hours a day in the office, maybe they actually weren't. Maybe they were only working 2 hours a day, and a lot of the time was spent on nonsense, moving around between meetings, trying to get things to work, etc. What if you can do meetings on Zoom or on online platforms? Will that change the way we work? And that kind of leads into the next one, is that in World 1.0, how you kind of built your image was a nice suit, a tie, a fancy watch, Chad, and a business card that you would throw at anybody in your direction at a conferencing event, right? Whereas now, the way you set yourself apart is with good lighting. It's with a good microphone, a webcam, and a home office where your family don't come running in the middle of a news broadcast. So it definitely changes in the working world there, Chad.
Yeah, definitely. I love the idea of how these symbols are things that we used to use in the past to make us come across with more gravitas, Barry's favorite word. And it's true. Whereas now we kind of look at, like you say, lighting and microphone infrastructure and, your kind of backdrop in your home office. Like you say, if you want to succeed in this world that is World 2.0 and that is coming at us really, really quickly, it seems, it's not a bad idea to maybe put some investments in tech stuff that you potentially wouldn't have been interested in before. People like me would have had this stuff anyway because we kind of have enjoyed this stuff for some time. But yeah, definitely now is the time to kind of make those investments in the place of the old school suits, ties, watches, etc.
Definitely. The next one is that in World 1.0, we have restaurants, which are obviously closed right now. And so a lot of people are realizing that, oh no, maybe I was going to a restaurant 3 or 4 times a week, and now I'm forced to cook at home. World 2.0 is perhaps groceries and delivery. Thinking about the fact that I think a lot of people were reliant on restaurants for their food, and as a result, they didn't learn to cook, they didn't learn to prepare their own food, and they were spending huge amounts of premium on buying restaurant quality food a lot of the time. And so I think a lot of people are learning that maybe that's not possible anymore. Maybe I should learn to cook, and maybe I should learn to prepare food at home and reap the economic benefits of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I heard somebody else mention this idea, and for me, for a little while, it kind of rang hollow. But the more you think about it, like you say, when you start realizing what that premium is and how much money you can actually be saving by eating more at home, not saying restaurants are going to go away completely, but certainly I think it's a massive, massive threat to that industry, especially where, as you say, we're now upskilling ourselves in these times, cooking a bit better, getting a bit more adventurous, and, sort of on the back of that, saving loads of money as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think it'll be interesting to see what will happen to the restaurant industry once we open up again, and how quickly can they recover, and to what level can they recover.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of them are under serious stress right now, not being able to get foot traffic through their doors. I'm going to run through the last ones quite quickly, but to give you a sense of what this looks like. World 1.0, stupid nonsense. World 2.0, actual issues. So focusing on the actually important things, the things that really matter, rather than the nonsense we talk about in a time where things are normal. World 1.0, complacency. Life is very easy. Life is going well. Everyone's kind of relaxed. World 2.0, action. People trying to solve problems today because time matters. World 1.0, globalization. We'll get everything in from China. We will import from everywhere else. We will focus on the globe as a whole.
Yep.
World 2.0, decoupling. Realizing that we can't be too reliant on one supplier in one country or one country's resources. Or we have to look after ourselves sometimes and not rely on immigration or those sorts of things. So that's interesting, a change there. World 1.0, avoiding social issues. And World 2.0, avoiding layoffs. So a lot of companies are dealing with this right now. Like for World 1.0, the HR department and all of their leadership were focused on quite nice to have problems.
Yeah.
So like relatively nice to have problems. Whereas now World 2.0, all they care about is saving jobs.
Definitely.
And so it doesn't matter about your opinions right now. It doesn't matter about your ideas for the company going forward. Doesn't matter about any of that stuff. We're trying to save jobs. And the biggest one for me at the bottom here, Chad, is World 1.0, stasis. everything's going exactly the same, the status quo is in action. Will 2.0 change?
Yep.
Everything is going to change. The only constant is change. And so the better we are able to adapt to that, the better we are able to be flexible about what we think, what we believe, the better chance we have of actually surviving a world that is changing so fast underneath our feet.
Absolutely. And, obviously we've gone through that list and it's all logical, it all makes sense. But I think seeing it in a tabular format is really effective because it just rings home the idea of the contrast here between the two. We can, kind of extend these each into a paragraph of their own and kind of justify the reasoning, etc. But just seeing that in a simple tabular format for a blog post, certainly something different, Barry.
Yeah, definitely. This is why I love this blog, is that the blog is so succinct but so powerful in how they display information. And so in this blog post, there's a whole bunch more. I kind of pulled out a few to chat about. So I definitely would encourage you, go and check out Tyler Cowen. His blog is called Marginal Revolution. He posts like 3 or 4 times a day, which is crazy. Okay. And they're all good stuff, like very, very short pieces, a lot on economics, a lot on philosophy and those kind of things. It really is up my alley. And so if you like the kind of stuff we chat about here on the podcast, you'd love that blog.
Well, definitely do go and check that out. Now, keeping on the looking ahead note, we're talking about the actual platforms that facilitate this change to remote working and facilitate this change in communication all in all. And we recommended this app called House Party a few weeks back, which allows you to have these virtual house parties and play games really with friends. And there's been rumors circulating potentially by opposition apps really, now that they've seen such exponential growth, that downloading this app can allow the user's other accounts such as Netflix and Spotify to be hacked. Now, House Party have come back and tweeted that this is baseless, and what they've actually done, which I think is completely unprecedented, is offering a $1 million bounty for the first individual to provide proof of such a campaign, and they've listed the email address there for this $1 million. Insane to see this kind of action, and certainly putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, definitely. It's brilliant marketing, really, because they're trying to turn a rather nasty situation, a kind of situation that makes them look quite bad, and trying to turn it around and kind of put the pressure on whoever is spreading this news. I think why it's so dangerous for them is because we've seen lots of other kind of security concerns on people like Zoom and whatnot in the recent past, because they have all of a sudden these unprecedented volumes of people on their platform. And so there's obviously going to be small security bugs, there's going to be small issues because the software was not designed to have millions and millions of people on at the same time. And they're trying to figure out how do they change their business, how do they keep up with demand. And so that's why this is like in the realm of plausibility. And so House Party obviously come out and try and show that it's not the case. And they're trying to fight against that fake news, which is absolutely rampant at the moment.
Completely agree. Now, you hinted at a bit of fake news earlier on, Barry, and we actually didn't get there in terms of the South Africa part of the COVID-19 update. Let's just quickly throw it in. What was that fake news this week?
Oh, Chad, it really makes me angry. And I was getting visibly frustrated at my Twitter last night, which was what was getting to me. Basically, so everyone's talking about the vaccine. We chatted about Bill Gates right at the top of the episode. And for some reason, Bill Gates is in a lot of conspiracy theories at the moment. There's a lot of people throwing his name into these crazy conspiracy theories that really are terrible. And the one conspiracy theory that kind of took over South Africa in the last few days was this idea that Bill Gates wanted to test various vaccines on African people because their lives weren't as valuable as, say, Europeans or Americans. And so there were these 2 French doctors who mentioned something in that realm about trying to test vaccines outside of France, and there was huge controversy there. And then people started pulling up these random Bill Gates clips from like documentaries from 20-odd years ago and trying to claim that he was intending to test vaccines in Africa first. And so there was a huge hashtag that started. News 24 ran with it and wrote this like huge article about it. There was a hashtag called Africans Are Not Lab Rats, which went viral and went all over the country. Wow. And people were losing their minds. And there were lots and lots of angry things being thrown at them. Trevor Noah, who had interviewed Bill Gates the day before for his Daily Show, received death threats about it for interviewing Bill Gates. And Bill Gates was being thrown around like a crazy person. And I saw this morning, obviously it's not true, anyone think of a little consideration, Bill Gates is one of the people who's done as much as possible to save the lives of African people. I don't know if there's any one individual who's done more for African health than Bill Gates has, just in the amount of work and the amount of money he's put into that cause.
Definitely.
And so to try and suggest that he wants to now, depopulate Africa is just completely silly. People ran with it though because News 24, which is a very valid and trusted news organization, wrote a story about it. Yeah. And so then, Chad, I come on Twitter this morning and I see they've retracted it. They've retracted the story saying, we're really sorry, we made a big mistake. He's not trying to test vaccines in Africa. He's actually sending tons of testing kits and trying to help Africa deal with the virus. And so this retraction kind of rang hollow for me because it was such a big issue for 2 or 3 days that how do you know that you're going to get the retraction to everyone who saw that email and who has changed their opinion on Bill Gates or changed their opinion on how Africa is viewed in the rest of the world? And what made me even more sad was when I went to the replies on that News 24 retraction, and I would say 70 to 80% of them were just saying that no, Bill Gates paid News 24 to make that retraction. They actually are lying. The story is still true, etc. So this kind of fake news is something that I find horrifying. I think it's terrible for our democracy. It's terrible for freedom of speech. It's terrible for trying to make sense of our world. And it really frustrates me because people don't do even the smallest piece of research to back up their claims. And a claim like this, which is a very, very serious kind of defamatory claim on somebody, is a serious thing. And to just run with it and make it a meme, make it a hashtag and all that good stuff, it just shows the state of fake news in our world.
Yeah, that's really, really dangerous. I don't even know how it's good enough, that they can actually run with a story like that without checking their facts, etc. It's just not good enough. We just shouldn't stand by it. It's actually insane. And to be completely honest, I've actually stopped using Twitter mostly because I do find that I find myself clicking on these types of threads and just getting angered by the amount of commentary from people all around the world who really just don't think before they post something. I really do find that tricky on being on the platform. Is it something that I'm missing, or do you kind of feel the same thing typically, Barry?
Yeah, so I feel the same things in certain circumstances. So like yesterday I got very frustrated, but for me Twitter still adds an immense amount of value. I think it really depends on who you follow.
Sure.
You have to be very careful with curating your feed very carefully and only following reliable people.
Yeah.
I do a lot of blocking, so anytime I see someone who's doing this, because what Twitter does as well is that they often show you tweets of people you don't follow.
Yep.
They show you a tweet of someone because your friend liked a tweet and therefore it comes into your feed. And I'm like, that's nonsense. So I block a lot on Twitter to try and minimize that as best as I can. But when it comes to real-time news, when it comes to getting opinions from people that I respect and from people that I want to follow, I still find a lot of value from Twitter.
Yep.
But I totally get it, Chad. I totally get your sentiment there. I think it's a difficult app for people. I think it requires a lot of maintenance to make sure your feed is as clean and as reliable as possible.
Well, I didn't actually even think of doing that maintenance, so maybe I should, and maybe I'll be able to then get more out of it, like you are. So let's move on to our next segment. Develop and grow. Cool. So we've chatted a little bit about the Einstein biography Barry read by Walter Isaacson, and what are some of the additional things that you've now learned after finishing that, Barry?
Yeah, so I finished the book, and I do have it as a prop here, but then I realized we're doing audio only, so you won't be able to see it anyway. But the Einstein book was fascinating. I had this weird recollection where I kind of thought, Chad, that after reading this book of 550 pages of Einstein's life, that I would sort of understand his theories and I sort of understand his science, right? And I said to you that at one stage I thought I did understand it. I thought I'd grasped it. And I realized now at the end of that book that I don't have the scientific chops to understand his work. He clearly was very influential, and I have a small appreciation for what he did for physics, but I just don't have the theoretical understanding to actually understand those topics on a deep level. And so what I thought I'd do rather is pull out three kind of takeaways for me about his work life and about his habits and whatnot in his work environments, which are more transferable and more relatable to people like us, Chad, and not the theoretical physicists. So the first one is what I call intellectual honesty. And we've talked about this in the past, is knowing when we don't know something and being willing to admit that, right? Or being willing to change your mind when the evidence changes. Yep. So, for example, we've spoken a lot about how we hold on to these opinions very tightly, we hold on to these beliefs very tightly, and the moment that we become dogmatic is when we see evidence that disproves our theory, but we aren't willing to change our mind. Because we think it makes us look weak, we think it makes us look like a flip-flopper, we think it's embarrassing. Einstein was really, really good. At the moment evidence changed, he would change his whole theory. He wouldn't even care about it. He had no ego about his ideas. He had no ego about what he was doing.
Right.
For one example, at one stage of his career, he worked for 3 years on a theory. 3 years solid, working every single day at Einstein-level productivity, and got to the end of the 3 years, hadn't been able to prove it. All of a sudden, new evidence came to light that made his theory completely wrong, And he didn't cry about it. He didn't like fight about it. He literally dropped that theory and started a new thing the next day. And it didn't bother him at all. He didn't bother him that he'd lost 3 years, because in his mind, it wasn't losing 3 years, because in all those things that he tried to try and get the theory to work, he contributed more to science than a lot of people did with their actual discoveries, because he disproved a bunch of things. And so I think it's important for all of us to not hold our beliefs so tightly and be willing to change our mind, because it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of intellectual honesty, and we need more of it in our world.
Completely agree. I think it's an important message. And just to sort of talk back to the arrogance point I raised earlier on, the reason why arrogance bugs me so much is I don't understand how people can be when there's so much knowledge out there, there's so much to still learn. I understand there's amazing people out there in the world, but even the most amazing still have things to learn. And so, for me, when you kind of take that approach of, challenging everything that and, something like you mentioned, taking 3 years of work and being able to drop it at a hat when you realize it's kind of worthless is, certainly shows quite a lot of kind of humility and, as you say, intellectual honesty, which is an important attribute to have.
It really is, and unfortunately it's in very short supply in the world today. So if you're able to do it yourself, you'll put yourself in a league of your own, and you give yourself the chance to make actual breakthroughs that are actually going to help the world. The more you hold on to ideas just because they were what you believed previously, the less time you have and the less kind of chance you have of discovering the actual truth. So it's very important that. The second piece I pulled out was the concept of deep work. And so Einstein is obviously the most famous scientist ever lived. When he finally made those discoveries around special relativity and general relativity, he became this super famous figure because he had changed the nature of the cosmos and how we thought about physics. And so when he became famous, he was inundated with media requests, with journalists, people trying to get a piece of him, people trying to get him to cut ribbons and sign autographs and talk on programs and, all that good stuff. And he realized that this was all a distraction. All of the stuff was lots and lots of distractions. He could have easily kind of given up on his work and gone and become a public figure and spoken on panels and all that good stuff and led a very successful career. But he knew that he wouldn't be able to achieve the kind of things he had achieved before he was famous if he didn't commit to the kind of deep work that was necessary. So what that means is that he shut away all those distractions. He would go and hide in a cabin in the woods away from everyone else so no one could find him, so that he could spend long periods of time uninterrupted by other people to work on difficult topics. And that skill is so rare in our world today because we all have short attention spans. We have smartphones that ping us 1,000 times a day. We have distractions all over the place. If you're able to focus on one difficult task for a long period of time, and so I'm talking 3 or 4 hours at a time, without distraction, that is when the real breakthroughs come. Not when you're doing 20 minutes of work and then a distraction, and then 5 minutes of work and then a distraction, and then you check your Twitter, you check your Facebook, etc., and the whole day is just full of like tiny little pieces of chunks. Deep work is that idea of taking long periods of time without distractions, with your phone locked away in a cupboard, to work on difficult things, and that's where the real breakthroughs come.
Yeah, it's hard. That kind of level of focus is really hard, and something that I certainly need to, do a bit of work on as well. But you're right. It's when you kind of actually plunge yourself into that kind of mode of focus, and a lot of authors have written about this and that state of flow, where your sort of brilliant ideas actually come about, and you actually start to make a difference, which is certainly important.
And the last one is kind of related to what we chatted about, the 3 years of work, is perseverance. Right. So Chad, I don't know if you or I could have spent 3 years working on a theory that wasn't showing any promise. That to me is a level of perseverance and level of resilience that I don't know if I have. No. And it kind of talks to the man that he was, is that he was so dedicated to his craft and so dedicated to his work. And he realized the kind of problems he was trying to solve weren't problems that are solved like this. They were difficult problems that had flummoxed people for generations. And so he understood that in order to make those breakthroughs, it would take years and years of work. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think it's just a message for all of us to kind of realize that if you're doing something difficult, if you're trying to build something new, you're trying to build a new habit or learn a new skill or any of this stuff, you have to stick with it. You have to stick with it as long as you can. The moment you get to that first kind of plateau or the first time you don't feel like you're growing, you need to push through those plateaus and keep persevering, because that's the way you get through it. And I think Einstein really was a dramatic example of that. He worked his entire life for like 2 or 3 major discoveries that changed the nature of physics, he could have easily given up 2 years into that theory, right? Or 4 years into that theory, and we'd never have that insight. And so persevere on things that matter to you and things that are difficult, and you will reap the rewards in the long run.
Yeah, again, another important value to have. And, those plateaus that you mentioned are so normal in any kind of stage of learning a new piece of work or sort of working on something new. And at those plateaus, a lot of us are not strong enough to kind of keep on through it. Sometimes it's those marginal gains that are also important in spending that extra time in kind of getting through it. But yet some of us still kind of stick out those plateaus and actually fall off the edge of the cliff. Which we really shouldn't be doing. But 3 years, like you said, I definitely couldn't get to that kind of level. But you never know, maybe one day. Moving on to the next thing on this Develop and Grow segment. This week was webcast week. I don't know why, but kind of all the stars aligned, and I had invites to 4 webcasts this week. And, given that there wasn't a whole lot more to do, I thought, fantastic, let me kind of relish this challenge and sort of tune into each of these and get some little insights. So I'm kind of just going to go very briefly over each of the 4 and some of the key takeouts that I got from them, which I kind of strongly advise, if you do have any webcasts and they seem like they could be of value, take that extra time, take the 1 or 2 hours, tune in, because you could get some really cool things out of it. And the other cool thing is there's a chat going on, and there's an online community there where you can share different views and really, really get a lot more out of the whole process. So just onto the first one, which was a mental health webcast. One of the insights for me is how do you see this? Do you see this piece of time as a comma or a full stop? And based on the way that you see that, you completely can change your mental state. So is this just a pause in our normal lives, or is this just a complete dramatic disruption? And, kind of, if we just change the way we look at it and see it more as a pause, we'll kind of get ourselves out of that depth of despair and kind of feeling of hopelessness. The other thing was to keep to a daily routine, which is something we've already spoken a little bit about, but create your daily structure around looking after yourself. So Barry and I spoke this morning about his fitness routine, and he mentioned he needs to squeeze it in first thing in the morning, otherwise it's not going to get done, and if it doesn't get done, you're not feeling so great. So create that structure primarily around looking after yourself, whether that is journaling, whether it is doing your actual fitness routine, having little moments to just be quiet and be with your thoughts. Create your structure around that. Thirdly was this idea of not just using a journal for introspection and mental clarity, but also, if you're kind of not invested in the idea of using a journal, to kind of try and swing you that way. How cool would it be if a decade later you had this little piece where you could show your kids, where you could show your friends how you lived through this time, to actually look back on. And that's also another really cool thing that I thought, to kind of persuade people to keep journals. And then lastly was to just be wary of all of these 21-day challenges. The speaker actually said you can end up having challengitis. And it makes complete sense, because if you take on all of these channels at the same time, you might actually increase your overall anxiety. Now, the idea here is to give you something to do, but if you just taking them all on, you're actually just setting yourself an unachievable goal. What do you think, Barry?
I think those are all great points, and I like the last one the most. We chatted about the book Tiny Habits on an earlier episode, talking about that people try and take on too much too often.
Yep.
And you set yourself up for failure if you're trying to do a yoga challenge and a no chocolate challenge and a fitness challenge and a reading challenge, and it just becomes too much. And all of a sudden your day becomes a chore, because you've got this to-do list of all the challenges you've got to do.
Yep.
And it's just too much. So like you say, take it one step at a time. Figure out one thing to practice or one thing to work on at a time, and you're going to be much happier and you're going to have much better success over the long term. Remember, we don't have to change our entire life during this lockdown period. It's not about exiting this lockdown period as a brand new person with a six-pack and like no bad habits and all that good stuff. It's about being kind to ourselves and taking it one day at a time, and doing small bits at a time.
Absolutely. Well, moving on to the next one, which was a working from home webcast. And kind of one of the key themes here was just to talk to people who are leading others, to managers out there. And the key message was let go, trust your workers, and don't micromanage. Focus your time on taking care of the emotional state of employees, and let yourself be vulnerable too. If you as a manager can also mention without any sort of shame that you're also struggling through this lockdown situation, maybe you'll get a bit of a better rapport with your workers. And I think that's also quite important. And then lastly was to celebrate achievement. I think in these times where you're not in the office and you're still trudging away at home, without that achievement, some of it can kind of seem a little bit pointless. And so still celebrate those achievements with your workers and with your team, which I thought was also quite important. Secondly was this idea of a check-in and check-out that we now have to add to our meeting process because of the fact that we're now working from home and doing these remote interactions. The check-in stage is an opportunity for you to screen the room and get a feel for every single person's emotional state at the beginning of the meeting. And then the checkout stage is obviously tracking how that emotional state has changed. And lastly, it kind of makes a way for a summary of action points, which obviously, kind of follows by the agenda that you've discussed. And lastly was just a point in dealing with a surge in emails. Obviously, because we're not all in the same office and it's not so easy to go and poke somebody's shoulder, there's going to be a surge in emails. And so he kind of just said, try and avoid sending emails for everything. Try and just pick up the phone. You'll have yourself to thank, and everyone else will thank you as well for it. Barry, what do you think?
Yeah, I like it. I think I want to pull out the check-in and check-out thing because I've got a personal experience there. At our last startup, we used to do that in every single meeting in person or on Zoom.
Right.
And the check-in and check-out really is a cool way to do it. I think that it really kind of pulls out the humanity in the people in the room, and you see them not just as an employee, but actually as a human with actual other life. And a lot of emotional things came out of those check-ins and check-outs because you find out things about them that maybe they're struggling with, or maybe they really want to be celebrated, or they're enjoying, etc. That can really help you be a better manager and a better teammate. Definitely. So I'd really encourage it. I think it's a great way to do it. What's important, though, is that the managers and the leaders in those rooms need to take the lead there and be vulnerable in those check-in and check-outs to kind of set the stage so that everyone else doesn't feel like vulnerability is a bad thing. And if you're setting the stage and you're setting the example there, then it's a really good thing to do.
Awesome. Well, yeah, definitely would be interesting to see if people actually take that on. And hopefully we'll end this lockdown situation with more empathetic workforce as a whole. That would be really cool. The third webcast that I actually took on was a financial aspects kind of webcast. And some of the things I took out of there was the idea of globalization, which we've already spoken about in your table up above, Barry. But kind of the idea of how this pandemic will affect the way we look at globalization. Now that we've seen the effect of all of these border closures, and as you say, relying on different nations for trade, maybe that might actually end up changing, and we might end up decoupling, like you mentioned above. Changes in the way that we live, we've also spoken a little bit about that. In the retail sector, we're likely to see some very permanent damage. We've been more reliant on online shopping ever than before. I know in South Africa it's a bit different. I believe takealot.com is kind of an empty website at this point in time, and you're actually not allowed to shop. But here, Amazon is still very fully functional, and so are a lot of other online players. And then also just in terms of working from home, we've chatted about that. But the idea of where you said that remote working is going to be the default, how is that then going to have an effect on real estate, on these big office blocks that companies have been paying loads of fixed costs in the form of rent to? Potentially it'll switch to a 2-day work week or 2-day week where you need to actually come into the office. And that will certainly let employers and companies scale down quite a lot, which will obviously change the real estate landscape too. And lastly was just on the government interventions point, where if we look in all likelihood, it's going to be likely that governments are going to have to bail out airlines at some point of this pandemic. They've been asked to shut down with sort of no real end date in sight, and it's just a matter of time really before these things start collapsing without bailouts. And the interesting bit there is the catch-22 that this poses in terms of climate change. Now, if a government bails out an airline, what sort of message does that send as to their compliance with trying to bring down climate change efforts? What do you think, Barry?
Yeah, it's really interesting to see. I think that, like you say, that the airline industry is significantly affected, and it really is changing the way we think about travel. I think before this virus, global travel was kind of a given, and it really was all around the world and was important for global business and for people moving about from country to country. It's really going to change now to think about what is the impact of this airline industry, and how much money we're willing to sink into it to try and get it back on its feet. How much of this travel is actually necessary, how much of this travel is required or is actually needed. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I think, like you say, the bailout's going to have to come in some way or form. But it's going to be a difficult one, because I think a lot of people are learning from this experiment that a lot of this stuff can be done remotely. A lot of this stuff can be done from home.
Exactly.
And so maybe you'll see travel go down. I don't know. Certainly going to change the way we think about travel in the long term.
Yeah, definitely. And then on to the last webcast, Barry, which was sleep. Obviously, the ever important and the one that we fascinated by after reading Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. I'm going to say that the most of the insights here were the same as what you'd get from that book, but I'll quickly just mention a few of them here. So the first one was just go to bed and wake up at the same time daily, even on weekends, and especially in this lockdown period where we kind of don't even know what day it is anymore. It feels like an extended weekend. But even on weekends, wake up at 7 if that's what time you wake up in the week. Because extending that by an hour is actually just doing an involuntary jet lag, which is an insane thing to do if you think of it like that. Try out the benefits of power naps now that work from home allows. One of the things that Matthew Walker mentions in Why We Sleep is that as humans, we're kind of accustomed to biphasic sleep cycles, and we actually feel that dip in our energy after lunch, and kind of need that little power nap. So try doing power naps now that you can. These must not be after 4 p.m. and not be longer than 20 minutes for you to get the full benefits from it. Just try it out and see what you think. And then lastly is your evening routine. So in terms of the conditions that we need to fall into sleep, temperature drop is needed. A lot of people think 17 degrees Celsius sounds freezing, but funny enough, that's what you need to actually commence successful sleep, is a bedroom that's at that temperature. So if you've got central heating on in your flat, you're actually just being counterproductive in that sense. And then in terms of when you eat, the longer the fast from your last meal to bedtime, the easier you'll fall asleep. In terms of your alcohol consumption before bed, it may feel like you're sleepy after having a couple of pints of beer, but because it's a sedative, but it's actually disrupting the quality of your sleep. So just try and look at the last beer you've had before bed, and try and time it in the longest possible gap. And lastly, in terms of your lighting, so the role of blue light, we've all heard about sort of melatonin and all that kind of stuff. So 2 hours before bed, you really need to try and start dimming yourself down. Turn all your blue light filters on that you possibly can. And as a sort of hard and fast rule, try and cut all the electronic screens out 30 minutes before bed, just to try and not disrupt your sleep patterns. Barry?
Yeah, I like it all. I think it's very similar to what Matthew Walker said in that book, and it's something that I try and do as best I can.
Yeah.
What I struggle with is power naps. I can't seem to get those to work, Chad. I try and do those power naps, and I
Really?
wake up feeling like a zombie. I wake up feeling like even worse than I did before I went to sleep. So I'm still working on that piece, but the rest I try and do as best I can. I find it really difficult to put the screens away as early as I should be.
That's true.
I find myself getting this bad habits where I'm sitting scrolling through Twitter, for example, late at night when I shouldn't be. But I think these are things to work on, and these are things that will really make a difference when it comes to the quality of your sleep, which matters way more than how many hours you get.
Yep.
It's about the quality you get, and it's going to make you feel even better and more productive in the days to come.
Absolutely. It's that ever so important thing of sleep that we think is trivial, but really affects everything from weight to, appetite to productivity and sort of just health and happiness and enjoyment. So yeah, if we can kind of try and aim for any of those, that would be a good place to be. Now let's hear from you on our last segment of the podcast.
What's on your mind?
Cool. So I actually forgot to apologize right at the top of the episode. Last week, we just didn't have any questions because I actually went out on my Instagram feed and asked if anyone had any questions and just assumed no one replied, not knowing that I actually had to go back into the post to actually check the responses. And I really, really apologize to all of my friends who did send in questions. I've been bad. There were some questions. And so we're going to take them on now. Better late than never, Barry, right?
Yeah, definitely. I do apologize on Chad's behalf to all his friends. He won't do it again. He now knows where the questions are. So please do send through your questions every week. We love hearing from you and trying to do our best to answer them.
Cool. Well, let's start off with the first one. This one is from Cull, which is, what are you doing as a coping mechanism during the lockdown period? And is there anything in particular you've set as a goal for yourself during this time? Barry?
Yeah, so coping mechanism wise, I'm trying to phone a friend every single day.
Okay.
That's kind of been my little thing to try and keep myself not feeling so isolated.
Yeah.
And so it's been really nice to kind of jump on a video call and try and call at least one friend every day. Just try and catch up with them, hear how they're doing, kind of commiserate with what they're dealing through in their quarantine, wherever they are in the world. And that's been really good for me, just to try and keep me social and keep me talking to people that I care about. And often I found that I have catch-ups that I haven't had in a long time because life was so busy before this time, right? And so I've heard a lot of things and had really good chats with people that I haven't had a good, deep chat for a long time. So I'd say that's probably my coping mechanism. Goal-wise, I actually haven't set any goals for myself, and I'm quite proud of myself because usually I'm very like specific about that, and I have 18 different goals for the lockdown period. But like we've mentioned in the past, I've gone through a bit of a tough mental health kind of year or so. And a lot of it, I think, is because I have been too hard on myself and I haven't been meeting kind of some of the goals I've been setting. And so I've really enjoying. I've certainly got things that I'm doing during this period, but I haven't set a specific goal that has the chance of disappointment during this time. I'm just trying to look after myself and make small steps on my larger goals, which are more like long-term, rather than a 21-day goal. What about you, Chad?
Amazing. I think a lot of people are going to take a lot of insight from that, just in terms of being easy on yourself and having an idea of things you'd like to get done, but don't hold yourself to it in that kind of way that you're sort of setting yourself up for failure. And if you do fail at it, it'll affect your mental health. In terms of me, what I would say as a coping mechanism would probably be exercise. To be honest, so I've been joining in HIIT sessions with my fiance. I've also then been heading onto my turbo trainer and watching Zwift, and also just heading outside because we were allowed to for one exercise session a day, only every couple of days, just to get some sun and feel the fresh air and really have a nice little run and be with my thoughts. In terms of goals, I've really just been trying to still be productive. So I haven't, like you, Barry, I haven't set a specific goal. By the end of this lockdown period, this is what I've done. But I'm just trying to be productive. So every single day, I'm kind of taking it a day at a time, and trying to not spend hours and hours watching Netflix, watching YouTube, etc., and kind of getting into something, creating. I've got loads of vlogs from back last year, so it's been really good to have time to go into that. Some photo shoots and stuff that I hadn't edited pictures from. Go into that, kind of get all of those things done, and I've really just been enjoying keeping productive. But then on the weekend, it's kind of the opposite. So then on the weekend, I still allow myself to unwind as if I was not on lockdown, and this was just a never-ending time, which it can definitely feel like. Moving on to the next one, from Ryan: is the media and social media causing unnecessary and widespread panic? What do you think, Barry?
It's a difficult question because the media and social media is such a vague term and it encapsulates so many different people and different outlets, right? And so I think it's important to realize there is good and bad in the media. There are certainly some people who are going over the top and are spreading unnecessary panic. But there's also people who are not spreading enough panic, right? And are not taking it seriously enough. And so right across the spectrum, there's various people talking about different ways of dealing with this. I think for us as individuals, it's important to take all of it with a pinch of salt, to actually do your fact checking and like look behind the scenes, try and understand what is the audience that media outlet's trying to sell into, how are they trying to clickbait, how are they trying to make money off this. If we understand those incentives underneath those messages, it makes them a lot more palatable, it makes them easier to understand, and to realize that please don't spend your whole day reading media stuff. Please, like we said in the early episode, maybe take 1 or 2 moments during the day to check up and see what's going on around the world. But if you're going to spend your whole day watching CNN or watching Twitter or any of this stuff, you're gonna feel miserable. So I think it's a hard question to answer. There's good and bad. Just take everything with a pinch of salt.
100%, yeah. Don't have too much to add to that. I think there's something about panic that us as readers and listeners, actually like to get swept up in, and I think that's what media houses actually play to. So it's up to us to close the taps, stop that constant inflow of information, and I think that definitely helps, like Barry mentioned as well. Now, moving on to the last question. This one is from Michaela, and she says, "Would love to hear a singing demo or different styles between you and Barry, just for fun." Barry, what do you think?
Oh, putting us on the spot here, Chad. Michaela, I appreciate the question, but putting us on the spot big time. I think, Chad, we lost a musical superstar in this last few days, a guy by the name of Bill Withers, who is an amazing voice, an amazing songwriter from the Motown era.
Yep.
I certainly was influenced a lot by his music, and so Chad suggested that maybe we should do one of his songs. What do you think, Chad?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a great idea. And, if at this point in the podcast, this doesn't tickle your fancy at all, it's right at the end. You're not going to miss anything else. So you can definitely tune out. But if you'd like to hear us have a little quick sing along, we're going to quickly do a little bit of Ain't No Sunshine by Bill Withers. Okay, let me get my guitar.
Cool.
Ain't no sunshine when she's gone. It's not warm when she's away. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone, and she's always gone too long. Anytime she goes away. Wonder this time where she's gone. Wonder if she's gonna stay. Ain't no sunshine when she's gone, and this house just ain't no home anytime she goes away.
Oh, what a song there, Barry. Hopefully we did it some justice. I certainly enjoyed that. Something a little bit different for our podcast, and hopefully paying tribute to such an amazing artist.
Yeah, R.I.P. Bill Withers. His music stands with us today. I was listening to his backtrack in the last couple of days, and he's got some real amazing music. So R.I.P. Our thoughts are with his family, and thank goodness for his music.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the close of yet another jam-packed episode of Across the Pond. Barry, we're going through this thing as always. Hopefully we start to introduce ourselves to some new listeners.
Yeah, please, if you guys know of friends of yours and might be interested in this kind of thing, please do share it with them. We'd really love to grow our audience even bigger. We're loving doing this, and we're getting lots of good feedback from it. So please do share it with us, with people that you care about, and on social media. We'd love to see it, and we really appreciate you taking your time to listen to us.
Absolutely. If you are still listening right at the end of this episode, thank you so much for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed it in its entirety, and this was episode 22 of Across the Pond. We'll see you next week.
Pond, across the pond.